Hey everybody, this is David Warner with another M365.video SharePoint short. Today we're going to take a look at the SharePoint Framework packaging process and see how we can use dynamic bundling. Now, dynamic bundling is a super powerful feature that gives us the option to split our bundled JavaScript file into multiple files that can then be asynchronously imported at a later deferred execution point, like for example when someone clicks a button after our solution has been loaded and the page has been loaded. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the default bundling process, and we're going to compare that to the dynamic bundling and see how it's different and the benefits of using it. Then we're going to take a look at a sample web part that demonstrates how we can set up our solutions to use dynamic bundling. It's very cool. I guarantee you're going to want to start using it immediately. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the default package bundling that the SharePoint Framework does. When we create a SharePoint Framework solution, all of our functionality gets bundled into a single JavaScript file, as you see in the screenshot. Even if it includes functionality that isn't invoked until, for example, a user clicks a button, even if it includes a library such as jQuery that also isn't used until a user clicks a button, it gets bundled into this single file. As you can see, it can get quite big. In this case, it's 100K. Now let's take a look at dynamic package bundling. This allows us to split our functionality into multiple JavaScript files and then load those JavaScript files at execution time, for example, when a user clicks a button, instead of at the initial load of our solution. As you can see in the screenshot, this allows us to take about 88K worth of content and functionality and move it outside of the initial load of our web part, which now is only 14K. Let's look at a demo where we can create a web part that allows us to showcase how to dynamically bundle our solution. So we're going to create some functionality that is executed when a user clicks a button, and when this button is clicked, we will asynchronously import our separate bundles. We'll then take a look at what code is needed within our solution that will tell SPFx to create these separate bundle files when we're packaging our solution. Let's start by seeing what the web part looks like. We see here it's just based on an out-of-the-box web part that we had scaffolded. We've added a little bit of a description and a couple of buttons. Now the concept here is that when we click the first button, dynamically import functionality, there's simplistic functionality that will occur. It's going to write a console log. The second though, it's going to actually import jQuery and it's going to write some HTML into the web part. Now because we're not using jQuery until we've actually clicked this button, we really don't want it to load by default with the web part, so we're going to make that part of our dynamic bundle as well. Let's take a look at the code. Let's start out in the default web part TypeScript file. We see here this includes the HTML output that I had showed earlier. So this includes our content, it includes our buttons here, the two anchor tags. It also includes the click events being wired up for each button. So we see that our first click event is connected to a function called dynamically import functions. Our second click event is connected to a function called dynamically import functions jQuery. Now each of these functions exist in separate TypeScript files. You see here we've got dynamic import functions and dynamic import functions.ts. Now let's take a look at what each of those do. The simple dynamic import functions TS just writes a message to the console log. As we mentioned, it's just a very simple example. The second one is a little more complex. It's going to import the jQuery library. It's going to include some CSS. It's going to execute a function that writes more information to the console log, and then it adds the jQuery imported class name to the body element. Then it's going to go ahead and add some information to the web part document object model. We're just going to inject a div here with some content. Now, if we were to import these two TypeScript files using standard methods, all of the functionality, including the jQuery library, would get bundled into that single file, even though we're only needing jQuery when we click on that second anchor tag, that second button. So how can we dynamically separate out the functionality into multiple bundled JavaScript files and only import them asynchronously when the user actually clicks on the button? The way we make that work is by wiring up each of the click events to asynchronous functions. So if we look at our first simple example that writes to the console, it's connecting to a function called dynamically import functions. We can find that right down here. It's a very simple function. It's set up as an async function. We create a constant that then is connected to an await statement. And within that await, we connect it to an import, which looks at our dynamic imported functions TypeScript file. Once we've imported it, then we can reference the functions that exist within it. This will tell SharePoint Framework, when it's packaging our solution, to put those functions in a new file. Same with our more complex one. If we look down here, we've got an async function set up for the import functions jQuery. This too will cause that TypeScript file right here to be bundled into a separate file. And what's super awesome is not only is the functionality we're looking at in this file included in the separate bundle, but so is jQuery. We've imported it here on line 10 as a library, and so now that will be included in the separate bundled file, separate bundled JavaScript file as well, which means we're not needing to load jQuery until it's absolutely needed. So let's take a look and compare what the results are when we dynamically bundle our files. In the Top Explorer window, we see here what the results are if we just simply use the default bundling. It's included all of our functionality and it's 100K. But if we look at the second Explorer window, see what's happened? It's created 2 additional bundled files. Each of them represent the TypeScript files that include our functionality. The one that writes to the console, we see that that's very small, 1K. But the one that includes the jQuery library and writes some content to the DOM, well, we see the bulk of that functionality is now 87 kilobytes. That's only executed and included when our user clicks the button. Our primary load is only 14 kilobytes. Now, not every use case is going to allow us to build our SharePoint Framework solutions using dynamic bundling, but anywhere we can use it is going to increase the overall performance of our SharePoint sites. Now, lastly, let's see what happens when we execute our functionality in the web part on a page. I pre-populated the web part on the page. I've also brought up the developer toolbars here and pre-selected the network tab. This will allow us to analyze the network. When we click our button, we'll go ahead and see the asynchronous request for our separate bundled JavaScript file, the one that actually loads jQuery and includes all of that within it. So if we go up to our second button, we're going to click on the dynamically import functionality with jQuery button. Go ahead and do that. And we see our bundled file has been imported and it's been executed because we also see our jQuery has been dynamically imported content has been injected into our web part. I hope this has given you a good introduction of how you can use dynamic bundling within your SPFx packaging. If you'd like to learn more, I've included a couple links that'll be of use. The first is the official Microsoft documentation. This is always going to be the most up-to-date on the topic. The second is a link to my blog site. That includes information that we've covered today, the video, as well as a link to GitHub where I've uploaded the web part that we used in our demo. Thanks again for taking the time to watch.